ever get that feeling? Like, there's more to you than anyone else can see. Like a hidden well of potential. Maybe even you haven't quite figured it out yet.
Yeah, that sense of having more to give, it's pretty universal, I think. A lot of people feel that.
I think so too. And that's really what we're diving into today. This whole idea of hidden potential. We're going deep with Adam Grant's book, Hidden Potential, The Science of Achieving Greater Things. That's our main source for this deep dive today.
And yeah, as we go through Grant's ideas, we're going to be pulling out the research he uses, the examples he gives.
Yeah.
Our real aim here is to show you that potential. It's not like this fixed thing, You're not born with it blazing or destined to stay hidden.
Right.
It really is about growth and effort. And this is key, the opportunities that come your way.
Right.
We want to give you, hopefully, a more hopeful and, more importantly, actionable view of what you and everyone around you is really capable of.
All right, so let's start with what people used to think about all this, about who we are. Way back in the late 1800s, this really famous psychologist, William James, he said, by the time you hit 30, your character, that's pretty much it, set in stone, like concrete. You can't change it.
Yeah, and that idea stuck around for ages. But here's the thing, Grant. He brings up some recent findings that are turning that idea on its head.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about this study with 1,500 entrepreneurs in West Africa. These are adults in their 30s, 40s, even 50s, running all kinds of businesses.
Wow, okay.
And the researchers split them up. Some got training in thinking skills, others got training in what we call character skills. Things like taking initiative, sticking with things, perseverance.
Okay, so these are experienced business owners. Did they change at that point in their lives?
They totally did. Both groups showed huge improvements in the areas they were trained in. So the takeaway here is that feeling of, oh, I'm stuck with my character, I'm past that age. It's just not true. The science is saying even adults, they can really develop these crucial skills. Yeah. Character, it keeps its ability to change, its plasticity, as Grant calls it, way into adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
So James was a big deal, but it seems like the science has moved on from that specific idea.
Right. And that actually brings us to something Grant talks about, a distinction that's super important. Personality versus character. We kind of use those words like they're the same thing, don't we?
All the time. But think about it this way. Personality, that's kind of your natural wiring. It's your go-to way of thinking, feeling, acting. But character is about choosing your values over those instincts. It's what you do with those traits. So you might naturally be more of an introvert, but your character, that's what decides if you push yourself to connect with others when a project really needs that, that teamwork.
Yeah, it's not just who you are deep down. It's the choices you make about who you want to be. And that kind of leads to something I've always thought was weird, this term soft skills. Grant actually goes into the history of that phrase.
Yeah, and it's pretty fascinating. So soft skills, it all started with the U.S. Army back in the late 1960s.
Really?
Yeah, they were trying to broaden their training. It wasn't just about operating machines like tanks and guns. That was the hard skills, working with equipment. And soft skills, they got this kind of strange definition.
Okay.
They were called important job-related skills that involve little or no interaction with machines.
So that means teamwork, communication, leadership, all those crucial people skills, they got called soft just because they didn't involve metal and gears. It seems almost ridiculous now. Those skills they're essential for pretty much every job.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, the psychologists who came up with that term, they ended up regretting it later. Yeah, they realized calling those skills soft, it made them sound less important, when really those social, emotional, behavioral skills, they're a huge source of strength. Even something like finance, if you think about it, by that definition, that would be a soft skill. It doesn't directly involve, hands-on stuff with a machine.
Right.
It just shows how misleading that label can be. So remember, those aren't soft skills. They're fundamental strengths of character.
Okay, so character skills, super important, and importantly, we can develop them throughout our lives. So how do we actually start tapping into that hidden potential? Grant has this great idea. He calls it becoming a creature of discomfort.
Yeah, I love that phrase.
Me too. It's so powerful.
It is, and he illustrates it so well with the stories of these people who speak tons of languages, polyglots, like Sarah Marie and Benny. And what's amazing is they didn't suddenly overcome some mental block. It was about shifting their mindset. They got comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's not about magically becoming a natural. It's about accepting, even embracing that awkwardness of being a beginner, right? What does that take? What kind of courage do we need to do that?
He breaks it down into 3 types of courage. First, the courage to ditch the methods you always use, your go-tos, because what's always felt comfortable, it might actually be holding you back. Second, the courage to jump in before you feel ready. You don't have to be perfect to start. And third, the courage to make more mistakes than anyone else even tries. Because mistakes, they're just part of the learning process.
It's so true. We spend so much time trying to find that right way to learn, our learning style. But is that even a helpful way to think about it?
The research is pretty clear on this one. People might have preferred ways of learning, but those preferences, they're not set in stone. And if you stick to them too rigidly, it can actually slow you down. Sometimes learning is better when it feels harder because it makes you really engage. If you only stick to your strengths, you never get a chance to improve your weaknesses.
So pushing past that initial dislike or difficulty, that can be a huge part of it. Grant uses the example of Steve Martin and how he felt about writing comedy when he was starting out.
Oh yeah, Steve Martin, he hated writing comedy at first. It did not come naturally to him at all. He procrastinated like crazy, which psychologists often say isn't just laziness. It's about avoiding those bad feelings a task brings up.
Oh, interesting.
So for Martin, borrowing other people's jokes, that was fun and easy. But he realized to really succeed, he had to face that discomfort, that struggle of writing his own material.
It's amazing how we naturally avoid things that feel hard, even if we know they're good for us. It's almost like, think about just listening to something versus actually sitting down and reading it.
That's a good point. So listening, yeah, it might feel easier, more enjoyable, but reading, in general, it leads to better comprehension, you remember more. It just makes your brain work harder. There have even been studies that show people do better on those logic puzzles when the information is written, not spoken. When you read, you're kind of forced to slow down, really think things through.
Makes sense.
And that helps organize the information in your mind.
And what about learning languages? We touched on the polyglots earlier, but Grant also really highlights the importance of actually producing the language, not just understanding it, right?
Huge, yeah. So meta-analyses, those are studies that look at the results of a bunch of other studies. They show that students who are taught to actively use a language, speaking and writing it, they become way more fluent than those who mostly focus on just understanding.
Interesting.
This is like the whole idea behind flipped classrooms, where students might study vocab beforehand, and then class time is for actually talking, using the language. That old saying, use it or lose it, that doesn't even really cover it. If you don't actively use it, you might never truly grasp it in the first place.
Yeah. And Sarah Maria, she moved to Madrid. She really immersed herself in a Spanish-speaking environment, which is a perfect example of seeking out that discomfort to speed up learning.
Totally.
Yeah.
There's a choice, a deliberate choice, to put herself in a situation where she had to face that language barrier, like every single day. And it worked. She realized if she could keep pushing past that initial discomfort, she could learn any language.
But for someone who's naturally shy, like Benny Lewis described himself as being, the idea of constantly putting yourself out there, making mistakes in a new language, that must feel really scary.
Oh, it can be, definitely. Yeah. And that's where these therapy techniques, systematic desensitization and flooding, they come in.
Okay.
Systematic desensitization, it's about gradually getting used to a situation you're scared of, starting with small steps. And flooding, that's more like intense, immediate immersion. You just jump right in.
So Benny, he actually used both of those techniques in learning all those languages.
He did, yeah. He started with systematic desensitization, putting himself in slightly uncomfortable social situations. Like, he would wear a funny hat to get people to talk to him. He'd hand out earplugs at concerts, stuff like that. Yeah, and that helped him slowly get more comfortable with starting conversations. And later, when he moved to Italy, he basically used flooding, full immersion in the language and culture. He forced himself to communicate, even though he was initially shy.
Wow. Okay. So embracing discomfort, that's clearly a big part of it. What else is key to unlocking hidden potential? Grant talks about being a sponge, right?
Right. And what's interesting here is being a sponge, it's not just about soaking up information. It's about actively seeking it out.
Yeah.
He uses these 2 javelin throwers as examples, Ihab Abdelrahman and Julius Jaego.
Okay. Tell me a bit about how they approached their training.
So Ihab, he was super coachable. He got a scholarship to train in Finland, which is a real javelin powerhouse. He worked with a top coach. He got better by following instructions carefully. But his approach was kind of reactive. When the money for his training in Finland ran out, he basically stopped training. He was really reliant on those external resources.
And Julius Jaego, his path was different.
Oh, completely different. Apart from a few months in Finland, Julius was mostly self-taught. He was online all the time watching videos of other throwers figuring things out. And he adapted techniques to his own style, even if it looked unconventional. I mean, he'd often end his throws in this, like, almost breakdancing pose.
Wow.
And even with a major injury, he still won an Olympic silver medal. What's crazy is his rate of improvement. It didn't just stay steady, it actually increased over time, unlike a lot of his peers who had more traditional coaching.
So Julius was like the ultimate proactive learner, finding knowledge, filtering it to fit his needs and abilities. But Grant also says being a sponge isn't just about taking information in, right?
Right. It's also about filtering that information well. Grant talks about how early on he would try to absorb all feedback after giving presentations, and it just left him overwhelmed.
Yeah, I can see that.
He even got feedback that he lacked confidence, even though he was trying to use every suggestion.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of trying to please everyone, take in every piece of advice. How did Grant learn to filter that feedback better?
He uses Melody Hobson as an example. So early in her career, she was so good at absorbing information, she was actually described as a ball hog in meetings. She would dominate the conversation without meaning to. So she learned to adapt by asking more questions and really focusing on bringing others into the conversation. She turned that potential weakness into a real strength.
That's a great example.
So being a sponge, when it's done right, it's both proactive, seeking knowledge for yourself, and pro-social, sharing knowledge and asking thoughtful questions to help others.
That outward flow is so important, just as much as what we take in. Okay, so we've talked about embracing discomfort, being a sponge. Now, what about our imperfections? Grant has this whole chapter called The Imperfectionists.
That's such a liberating idea. He argues that unlocking potential, it's not about being flawless. It's about learning to live with those flaws, even. It's part of becoming an expert, continuing to grow. As you get better at knowing which imperfections you can accept and which ones you need to work on.
It's almost like counterintuitive, isn't it? We think of mastery as perfect execution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He tells the story of this architect, Tadao Ando. He was self-taught. And get this, he even built on an active fault line in Kobe.
Wow.
But after the earthquake there, he was so concerned about the community. His whole journey shows that achievement, it can come from anywhere. It doesn't have to be perfect from the start.
I totally relate to that pressure to be perfect. I remember my mom used to say, do your best and I'll be proud, but if you don't get an A, I'll know you didn't really try your hardest. It's funny now, but it really captures that expectation.
And that kind of pressure can really hold you back. Grant talks about his own experience in diving. His coach, Eric Best, he would always say, aim for a clear, high target, not some vague idea of perfection. So on a basic dive, the target might be a 6.5. On a harder dive, with a flip and a twist, a 5 was good progress. And for a brand new dive, anything above a 0 was a step forward.
That's a really good way to look at it.
The focus was always on improvement. He would say, closer to right has to feel wrong because you're breaking old habits.
It's about the trajectory, not the immediate result. My proudest moment in diving, it wasn't getting some perfect score. It was when Eric told me I'd progressed further with less natural talent than any other diver he'd coached. It showed me that success is often about what you overcome to get there.
Absolutely. But in fields where things are more subjective, like art or writing, it can be harder to decide which imperfections are okay. What one person sees as a style choice, someone else might think is a huge mistake.
So how do you figure that out?
Grant talks about what Twyla Tharp does.
Yeah.
She has this committee of judges who look at her choreography while she's still working on it. They give her critical feedback, help her see problems she might miss. It's about getting those outside perspectives to see if you're on the right track.
Like crowdsourcing quality control. And Grant also talks about how powerful it can be to get specific scores, even if they're low.
Yeah, like getting a 4.5 on a first draft. It's not just information. It can be a huge motivator to revise, get better. It helps you get ready for more detailed feedback. You see the gap between where you are and where you want to be. It's not about being perfect right away. It's about working on it until it reaches that point where it's, minimum lovable.
Right.
It's like that diving analogy again. A perfect 10, it's not about flawlessness. It's about being excellent, even though there's always going to be some imperfection.
Okay, we've covered embracing discomfort, being a sponge, striving for excellence over perfection. What's next in this journey of unlocking hidden potential? Grant talks about scaffolding, right?
Yeah, think of scaffolding as focused, temporary support to help you learn and grow until you can do it on your own. Like those structures they put up when they're building a skyscraper. They're essential to reach those heights, but they're meant to be taken down once the building is stable.
And he actually uses Tetris as an example of scaffolding. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, psychologists have found that playing Tetris can actually help with intrusive thoughts.
Really?
Yeah, it engages your brain so much with those falling blocks that you don't have the mental space for those unwanted thoughts. And other puzzle games, they don't seem to have the same effect. It's specific to Tetris, that kind of support for that specific challenge.
So it's about the right support at the right time. And where does this scaffolding come from in our lives?
It depends on the challenge. It could be a coach, a mentor, a teammate giving you a missing piece of information, or even a group effort to overcome something together. The point is, it's temporary. It's there to help you get to a point where you can stand on your own 2 feet.
So it's not about being dependent, it's about using help strategically to get to that next level. Okay, shifting gears a bit. Grant also talks about this idea of infusing passion into practice. It's not just about work-life balance, is it?
No, it's deeper than that. He compares work and play, purpose and purposelessness. And he suggests that real fulfillment, real growth, often comes from finding that balance between the two. He shares this amazing story of Evelyn Glennie, a world-famous percussionist. And get this, she's profoundly deaf.
Wow, I didn't know that. How did she even start learning music?
She learned to feel the vibrations through her whole body. Her teacher, Ron Forbes, he helped her connect different musical notes with specific sensations in her arms, her stomach, her cheekbones, even her scalp. She practiced barefoot to feel the vibrations better. For her, each lesson was this incredible challenge to really sense the nuances of sound. And as she got better, Ron kept raising the bar, making learning itself a joy, a challenge. She often says there was never a clear line for her between having fun and working hard.
That's incredible. So it's that variation, that constantly raising the bar that keeps the passion alive. It's clearly more than just that 10,000 hours of practice thing we hear so much about.
Definitely. That 10,000 hours idea, it's catchy. But research shows that the amount of time it takes to become an expert, it really varies.
Right.
It depends on the field, the person. What really matters is deliberate practice. Structured repetition, clear goals, immediate feedback. And that's especially helpful for tasks that are pretty predictable.
But then Grant brings up this idea of deliberate play, which I thought was so interesting. Where does that fit in?
Deliberate play, it's about bringing fun into skill development. Like some medical schools, they use improv comedy to help doctors get better at reading nonverbal cues, their communication skills. It's a way to practice important skills in a low-pressure, fun way. Deliberate play can also be something you do on your own, like a pianist sight-reading music, or someone practicing anagrams for Scrabble. It's about exploration and improvement, not just putting in the hours. And Grant uses Stephen Curry as an example. His success in basketball is a great example of this harmonious passion in practice.
Right.
So even though he's not like the most physically imposing player, his incredible success, it's partly because he genuinely loves getting better. And his coach, Brandon Payne, he incorporates a lot of deliberate play into his training. Curry thrives on that challenge of always improving, and that helps him stay motivated long term.
I love that.
This is what Grant calls harmonious passion, where rest is seen as essential, to keep going, not a setback. It's the opposite of obsessive passion, which can burn you out.
And sometimes taking a step back or even going in a completely different direction, that can lead to breakthroughs too. Grant calls this backing up.
What's interesting is that sometimes improvement comes from what looks like going backwards, taking a detour. Grant talks about a study of NBA teams where the star player got injured. At first, of course, the team did worse, but then when the star player came back, these teams actually started winning more games than before the injury.
That seems counterintuitive. How could losing your best player make the team better in the long run?
Well, without their star player, the other players had to experiment, take on new roles, develop new strategies. So when the star player came back, the team as a whole was more balanced. They weren't so reliant on just one guy. The adversity forced them to grow and adapt in ways they wouldn't have otherwise. The study even found there's an optimal amount of time for this effect, long enough to force that adaptation, but not so long that the team falls apart.
So sometimes getting stuck or hitting a setback, it can actually make a team more innovative, more well-rounded. Okay, so we're on this journey of learning and growth. How do we know if we're going in the right direction? Grant says we need a compass more than a detailed map.
That's such a good analogy. When you're learning something new or tackling a big challenge, You don't always need a rigid plan. What you need is a sense of direction, a compass. And that compass, it could be a book, online resources, even talking to someone with experience.
Right.
A good compass helps you adjust along the way because you will inevitably veer off course sometimes.
And he uses the example of the knuckleball in baseball, which is such an interesting pitch. It's not about traditional technique. It's about developing a feel for the ball and being able to adapt.
Exactly. And the knuckleball, it's notoriously hard to master, but it can also extend a pitcher's career because it doesn't rely on just pure strength. It's a perfect example of finding an unconventional compass that works for you. But finding the right guidance, that can be tough, especially when you're looking for advice from experts.
Oh, right. The curse of knowledge. I think that's what it's called.
What happens is experts, they know so much, they're so good at what they do, they often have a hard time teaching beginners. They've forgotten what it was like to not know, and they can't really understand why someone wouldn't get it. Plus, their strengths and weaknesses have changed so much, the way they got good might not be the best way for a beginner to learn.
So the person who's the absolute best at something might not be the best teacher.
Right, exactly. And Grant suggests getting advice from multiple guides, people who have different perspectives. He talks about R.A. Dickey, the baseball player, and his journey to learn the knuckleball. It was long, and it was tough. He got advice from all of these famous knuckleballers, Tim Wakefield, Phil Necro, Charlie Ho, and he spent years trying out their advice, which often contradicted each other. And he had minimal progress, lots of setbacks. It shows how important it is to learn on your own and to be persistent, even when it's hard.
Oh, we've talked about the benefits of detours, how they can lead to improvement. But what about when you just feel completely stuck? Grant calls this languishing.
Languishing, it's more than just feeling stuck. It can really drain your focus, your motivation. It's like a catch-22 where you start to think, what's the point of even trying? And the advice people usually give is just focus, eliminate distractions. But that's not always helpful.
And Grant uses R.A. Dickey's story here too, right? He decides to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. That seems like the opposite of focusing on his baseball career.
It was. And his team advised against it. But Dickey, he wanted to do this for charity. And this unexpected detour, it gave him a huge sense of purpose. It took the pressure off his baseball performance, and it boosted his confidence. And it all led to him having an incredible season after that. What looks like a sudden breakthrough is often the result of lots of small wins, and sometimes a complete change of scenery.
So sometimes the best way forward is to step away, do something completely different, even if it seems counterintuitive. It's about the long game, not just the immediate moment. Okay, we've talked a lot about individual growth, but Grant also really emphasizes the importance of working together. He calls it bootstrapping.
Yeah, and when he says bootstrapping, he doesn't mean that, pull yourself up by your bootstraps thing, that individualistic idea. He's talking about interdependence, people relying on each other to succeed. He uses this powerful story of the Golden 13, the first black officers in the U.S. Navy during World War II. They faced so many obstacles, so much prejudice, they were practically set up to fail.
Their situation was incredibly tough. How did they overcome all of that?
At first, they were just overwhelmed by all the stuff they had to learn. And they were in this hostile environment where they were expected to fail, even pitted against each other. But they made this decision to support each other, all for one and one for all. They studied together late at night, sharing what they knew. Even if someone only partially understood something, it helped.
Yeah.
And this collaborative learning led to the tutor effect. When you teach something to someone else, you actually understand it better yourself. So they were building their collective competence.
It's a powerful example of how shared struggle and collaboration can lead to success, even when the system is against you. Grant also makes an interesting distinction between teaching and coaching in this context.
Right. Teaching, it focuses on building competence, giving people knowledge and skills. But coaching, it's more about boosting confidence, encouraging people to believe in themselves. Grant tells this story about how, before a TED Talk, he was nervous, and he asked his daughter, who's usually shy, for a word of encouragement. And it gave him this boost of confidence. He also talks about Alison Levine climbing Everest, and how a comment from a less experienced climber who doubted her actually fueled her determination. It's like an underdog effect.
So even being underestimated can be motivating, especially when you have support.
Yeah, and the Golden 13, they use the low expectations and racism from some of their instructors as fuel to prove them wrong. They had this sense of responsibility, this desire to uplift their community. It shows that reaching great heights often means relying on others, believing in those who believe in you, even being motivated by those who doubt you, and always remembering the bigger picture, what you're fighting for.
We've talked about individual effort, collective effort. Now Grant brings up the role of opportunity, which is so crucial. And Raj Chetty's research really shows how important that is.
Shetty's findings are pretty stark. He linked family income to the chances of kids becoming inventors. And kids from the top 1% of earners were 10 times more likely to become inventors compared to kids from families below the median income.
10 times. That's a huge difference. Why is that? What advantages do kids from wealthier families have?
One big one is exposure. They're around more innovators, more role models. They have more access to resources and networks. Grant calls it having more compasses and pins. And geography matters too. Chetty's research showed that kids who moved to areas with more innovation were more likely to become inventors themselves. Even the type of invention was often influenced by where they lived. Like, moving to Silicon Valley made kids more likely to invent something in tech.
So potential isn't just about talent or effort, it's also about the opportunities you get. So how do we create systems that give more people those opportunities? Grant looks at the Finnish education system as a possible model.
What's interesting about Finland is they consistently do well in those international PISA scores. And at first, people were skeptical because of their unique demographics. But Estonia adopted a lot of Finland's practices and saw a similar success. The thing is, it's not one magic thing. It's a whole culture, built on practices, values, and assumptions about learning.
Okay, so what are some of those key practices?
Early intervention is big. They identify and address kids' learning needs early on, like even in kindergarten. And teachers, they have way more time for planning, grading, and professional development. It helps prevent burnout and encourages a love of teaching. They even have this idea of joyful, illiterate kindergartners. Early education is focused on play and exploration, not pushing academics too soon.
That's a big contrast to some other places where there's so much pressure for kids to learn academics early. Grant also talks about this Me and My City program in Finland.
Yeah, that's where sixth graders get to run mini companies. It's all about empowering them to learn and be intrinsically motivated. And parents, they're so important too. Grant tells the story about how his family read the Harry Potter books out loud together, and that led to a family book club, a real love of reading. It's about creating that culture of learning at home.
It's so powerful to nurture that desire to learn. And speaking of tackling big challenges like that Chilean mine rescue, Grant talks about building systems for collective intelligence.
Right. Instead of just relying on a few experts, the leaders of the rescue effort really sought out ideas from a lot of different people. They knew about the Babel effect, where the person who talks the most often gets seen as the leader, even if they're not actually the best. So they chose leaders who were good at listening, who could raise the level of the discussion.
Like Andre Sugaret, who led that mine rescue.
Yeah, exactly. He was all about listening, building a sense of teamwork, and he used techniques like brainwriting to get ideas from everyone anonymously. And some of the best solutions came from unexpected places, like this $10 phone from a small entrepreneur that ended up being a lifeline for the trapped miners. Grant also highlights W.L. Gore and their lattice system. Employees can bypass the usual hierarchy and get support from anyone. It's about encouraging innovation from the bottom up.
Right. So you prevent good ideas from being shut down just because they didn't come from the top.
Right. And the Elixir guitar strings, those were developed in Gore's medical products division. It's a perfect example of that. Great leaders, they build systems where everyone's voice can be heard.
Okay, so it's about creating environments where diverse perspectives are valued. Now, when you're bringing new people into organizations, how do you find those uncut gems, the people with hidden potential? Grant uses the story of Jose Hernandez, who got rejected by NASA multiple times. It's a great example of how traditional selection can miss out on great talent.
Yeah, Hernandez had a strong engineering background. He grew up as a migrant farm worker, overcame a lot of adversity, but NASA kept rejecting him for their astronaut program. They focus so much on past performance and credentials, they miss out on people's life experience, their growth. NASA didn't see all the challenges he faced and how resilient he was.
It's a reminder that you can't judge people just on their achievements at one point in time. You have to see the whole picture.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond that sorting hat mentality that prioritizes pedigree. Like Tom Brady, he was a late pick in the NFL draft. People didn't see his potential right away. We need to get better at identifying those character skills, like perseverance, adaptability. Those are better predictors of how far someone will go, even in highly selective fields like NASA. they initially didn't have good ways to assess those less tangible qualities, what they called the right stuff.
And then you have systemic inequalities, which make it even more complicated. How do you account for those disadvantages in selection processes?
It's tough. Policies that address hardship for groups are important, but they don't always capture individual struggles. The orchestra auditions behind a screen that helped with gender